In the quiet hours before dawn, a moment unfolded that would rewrite royal history forever. If you are fascinated by pivotal turning points and untold palace stories, make sure to subscribe right now so you never miss a single moment of this unfolding royal chapter. What began as a whispered conversation behind palace walls would soon ripple across the world, transforming the face of a centuries-old institution. It was not a scandal or a crisis that forced this change, but a deliberate, handwritten decision. At the heart of it stood a king, a pen, and a single act that would alter the monarchy's future. The stillness of that early morning did not reflect the storm brewing inside Buckingham Palace. Behind the gates, the air carried a heaviness that only a few could sense. Guards moved with subtle urgency, courtiers were called in at odd hours, and the palace corridors that usually echoed with a sense of timeless routine were suddenly filled with quiet, tense footsteps. What no one outside those walls could have imagined was that a letter, written in the king's own hand, sat waiting to be signed. It was a personal declaration, a turning point, a decision to step down not in defeat, but with conviction. This was not a reluctant farewell. It was a carefully orchestrated choice meant to secure a future he could no longer personally carry. The story of how this moment came to be is one that few inside the palace will ever speak of openly. For years, the weight of the crown had been both a symbol of continuity and a private burden. Each day was wrapped in ceremonial precision, public expectation, and the unspoken responsibility to embody a legacy larger than any one person. But behind that polished image, a quiet reckoning was taking place. A sense of time passing too quickly. A growing awareness that every public smile hid a private struggle. The king had spent months reflecting on the legacy he would leave behind. Not as a ruler, but as a father, a brother, and a man aware of his own fragility. In the small hours of the night, after much reflection and quiet conversations with those closest to him, he reached the moment of no return. His handwritten letter was unlike any royal statement in recent memory. It was not a speech crafted by advisors. It was not polished for public approval. It was raw, deeply personal, and final. This letter held the power to shape the future of the monarchy in a way no formal speech could. It expressed his regrets, his hopes, and his unwavering belief that stepping aside now was not a failure, but a gift to those who would inherit the throne. There is a certain quiet that falls over the palace in moments of great consequence. Not a silence of calm, but one thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Those who were awake that night felt it. They saw the way the king moved, how his steps were slower, how his gaze carried a mix of sadness and resolve. When the pen finally touched the paper, it marked the culmination of months of soul-searching. This was not a moment planned by publicists or announced through careful briefings. It was a private choice made public through a single letter. In those first few minutes after the ink dried, nothing in the outside world had changed. People slept in their homes unaware. Streets remained quiet. The world carried on. But within the palace, everything had shifted. The act of writing that letter was the symbolic unlocking of a new chapter. It was the moment a king became something else entirely, no longer the central figure of a realm, but a man making peace with the end of his reign. This decision was not made in weakness. It was made in quiet strength. It carried the gravity of centuries of tradition and the unmistakable humanity of a single person choosing when to let go. The historical significance of this letter cannot be overstated. Abdication has always been rare. A monumental act that breaks with royal continuity even as it attempts to preserve it. It requires a unique combination of courage, clarity, and an unshakable sense of responsibility. By choosing to step aside on his own terms, the king ensured that his departure would not be shaped by rumor or speculation. It would be shaped by his own words. It would be his legacy, written in his own hand. While the world often imagines the monarchy as an unchanging institution, the reality is far more complex. Behind the gilded facades and ancient rituals are real people, wrestling with private doubts, responsibilities, and the march of time. In this case, the king's decision to act before being forced to act was seen as both shocking and deeply human. It was a reminder that even those who wear crowns are not immune to the pull of their own mortality, nor the desire to control their own story. As the hours ticked on, the letter remained locked away, awaiting the precise moment it would be revealed. Only a small circle of individuals knew what it contained, and their faces reflected the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The palace, so often associated with continuity, was about to face a rupture unlike any it had seen in decades. Yet, there was also a quiet understanding that this was not chaos. This was a controlled, deliberate shift of power. The king was not leaving the monarchy in disarray. He was leaving it with a clear direction, a carefully crafted path forward. His words were not just legal declarations. They were a message to the family, to the institution, and to the world. He wrote of legacy, of healing old wounds, and of making way for a new generation of leadership. He acknowledged his own limits and placed his trust in those who would follow. He expressed gratitude, sorrow, and hope. In those handwritten lines, the entire arc of his reign found its closing chapter. By sunrise, preparations were already underway behind the scenes. Advisors began to assemble, not to challenge the decision, but to figure out how to present it to the world. The palace press officers, the ceremonial teams, and the personal staff all moved with the strange efficiency that comes when history is about to be made. Yet beneath that surface, the emotional weight of the decision hung heavy. This was not just the end of a reign, it was the closing of a personal story written in quiet ink. For those who witnessed that moment, it will forever remain etched in memory, not for its grandeur, but for its simplicity. One man, one letter, one decision that will echo for generations. A historic royal turning point, born not from crisis or conflict, but from the quiet courage to choose a different path.
When the clock struck midnight, a quiet meeting unfolded that would shape the course of everything that followed. In the dim light of a private study, far away from the ceremonial halls and public eyes, the king asked his sister to meet him. It was not a formal gathering. There were no aides, no advisors, no polished speeches. Just two siblings, bound by blood, legacy, and the impossible weight of a crown. The atmosphere in the room was heavy but intimate, the kind of quiet that comes when truth is about to be spoken. For years, the king had carried his struggles alone. Now, in this late hour, he needed to share them with the one person he trusted completely. He began to speak slowly, carefully, as if lifting a weight from his chest piece by piece. He spoke not as a monarch, but as a man who had spent years suppressing his private fears beneath public duty. He told her about the nights he lay awake questioning whether he could continue carrying the expectations placed on him. He admitted how time, once something that seemed endless, now felt short and fragile. He spoke of the loneliness that often comes with leadership, a loneliness that few would ever understand. For years, the world saw him as a figure of stability, but that stability came at a personal cost he could no longer ignore. She listened without interrupting. She had seen the signs long before this conversation. The fatigue in his eyes, the way his laughter had grown quieter, the long silences that followed public appearances. She knew this moment was coming, though she had never expected it to arrive so soon. When he finally confessed his plan, to step down on his own terms rather than wait for time to make the decision for him, she did not react with shock. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded. What mattered most was not the title he would be leaving behind, but the man sitting before her. This was not just a political or ceremonial act. This was something deeply human. Their conversation stretched late into the night. He spoke of his regrets, the moments he wished he had handled differently, the weight of expectations he had inherited long before he ever wore a crown. He reflected on the years spent living under the constant gaze of the public, where every gesture, every word, every silence was interpreted and magnified. He admitted how the pressure of preserving a legacy had, at times, overshadowed his ability to live freely. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to speak without filters or formalities. He was not speaking to a nation or an institution. He was speaking to his sister. She, in turn, spoke with the honesty only siblings can share. She reminded him of his strength, not the kind that shows in grand ceremonies, but the quiet kind that carried him through moments the public never saw. She acknowledged the burden he had borne, not just for himself, but for everyone connected to the crown. She also reminded him that stepping down was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Knowing when to let go, when to pass the torch, was in many ways the greatest act of leadership he could offer. In that dimly lit room, they stripped away the formality of their positions and spoke only as family. There was a particular moment in their exchange that would linger long after that night. He paused, staring at the letter he had written but not yet signed, and said softly that he did not want to leave behind uncertainty. He wanted his departure to bring clarity, not chaos. He wanted to give his family a stable foundation rather than a burden to untangle. This was not an impulsive act. It was a carefully considered choice. It was a decision of someone who had carried the crown long enough to know its weight intimately. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. It was not a grand gesture, but it carried the full force of their shared history. She had stood beside him through countless public events, but in this private moment, she stood beside him not as a royal figure, but as his sister. She told him that no matter what the world might say, history would remember this choice not for its shock, but for its courage. She told him that she would support him, not just as a member of the family, but as someone who understood the cost of wearing that crown. As their conversation went on, he revealed the depth of his reasoning. He had spent months reflecting on his health, the pressures of the role, and the toll it had taken. But more than anything, he wanted to see the future unfold while he was still here to guide it quietly from the sidelines. He did not want his reign to end in confusion or crisis. He wanted to make his own ending. In a world where so much of his life had been decided for him, this was the one choice that was entirely his. She spoke of the future as well. She understood the turbulence that would follow such a decision. The whispers in palace halls, the speculation, the debates. But she also knew that a clear, heartfelt abdication could be a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. The strength of the institution did not lie in one person's hold on power, but in the ability to adapt. And this, she told him, was his moment to shape that adaptation with dignity. He smiled faintly at that. For years, his duty had been to preserve what already existed. Now, he realized, he could also shape what would come next. In that realization, there was a quiet relief. The pressure that had sat like a stone on his chest for years began to loosen. The decision was still heavy, but it was his. And for someone who had lived under centuries of expectation, that mattered more than anything. Before they left that room, they shared one last, unspoken understanding. This was not just about him stepping down. It was about how they, as a family, would face the world in the days to come. She promised him that she would stand beside the next chapter, helping to hold the center steady while the world adjusted to the shock. He promised her that he would step back with grace, allowing space for the future to breathe. It was a promise between siblings, simple but profound. When she finally walked out into the cold night air, the palace grounds were silent. But inside her, something had shifted too. She understood the enormity of what was about to happen. She knew that in the days ahead, the world would see a carefully staged announcement. But what they would never fully know was the quiet midnight meeting where the decision was truly sealed. A brother and a sister, sitting together, letting go of centuries of pressure long enough to speak with nothing but truth. The letter sat on the polished surface of his writing desk, sealed and ready. It was unlike anything the palace had seen in generations, both personal and legally unshakable. Every word had been written in his own hand, every line a deliberate step toward the end of his reign and the beginning of something entirely new. It was not drafted by a team of legal minds or carefully shaped by committees. This was his voice, unfiltered, recorded on the page with remarkable clarity. When he wrote it, he did so with a quiet determination that no one could mistake. It was the letter that would reshape the monarchy's path for years to come. Inside the letter, he did not simply announce his decision to abdicate. He laid out the full framework of how he wanted his departure to unfold. The first lines carried the weight of confession, an acknowledgement of his own limitations and an admission that the time had come to step aside. He did not cloak his words in grand rhetoric or formal language. He spoke simply, directly, and from the heart. He wrote that serving the crown had been both the greatest honor and the heaviest burden of his life. He expressed gratitude for the support he had received, but he also admitted the growing distance between the role he was expected to fill and the man he truly was. As the letter continued, the tone shifted from reflection to action. He named his successor with full confidence, ensuring there would be no ambiguity, no room for prolonged uncertainty. He did not want a vacuum of leadership. He wanted a clean, immediate transition. His words made it clear that this was not a retreat but a handover. He also elevated his sister's role in the family's future, entrusting her with a stabilizing position that reflected not just his personal trust in her, but also her proven strength and dedication over the years. It was a symbolic gesture, but it also carried very real weight for the family's internal balance. One of the most striking elements of the letter was the passage in which he addressed the fractured bonds within the family. He wrote of old wounds and unspoken distances, of how the demands of the crown had at times overshadowed the bonds of blood. In carefully chosen words, he urged reconciliation. He asked that the future not be built on the silences and misunderstandings of the past. He wanted unity, not division, to define the next chapter. For someone who had spent a lifetime upholding public image, this was perhaps the most personal and vulnerable section of all. But he did not stop at sentiment. The letter also carried strategic clarity. It laid out how ceremonial responsibilities would shift, how formal titles would be adjusted, and how his own presence would quietly recede without causing institutional disruption. He had spent months studying the transition, ensuring that when the letter became public, it would leave little room for hesitation. It was designed to move swiftly and cleanly. His decision was final, and every word was chosen to make sure that those who followed would not spend months or years untangling what he had left behind. Perhaps the most startling part of the letter, for those who would read it later, was the section concerning ceremonial power. He stripped away certain privileges from those who had once shared the central spotlight with him. It was not a petty act. It was a deliberate effort to streamline the structure of the royal household, to make it leaner, quieter, and more focused on the future leadership. His words were careful, almost gentle, but unmistakably firm. It was a reminder that even in leaving, he retained the power to shape what came next. Those close to him knew how much of himself he had poured into this letter. It was not just a statement of abdication. It was a manifesto for the future. He was determined that when history looked back on this moment, it would see not a reign ending in confusion, but a transition carried out with precision. He wanted to leave a legacy of clarity rather than questions. He wanted his successor to inherit a strong, defined structure, not a maze of unfinished decisions. When he finished writing it, he did not immediately seal it. He read it again and again, making small adjustments, changing a word here, softening a phrase there. At times, he paused and stared out the window, lost in thought. He was not just writing for the institution. He was writing for his family. He was writing for the world that had watched him for decades. And in a way, he was writing for himself, marking the closing chapter of a story that had begun long before he ever wore a crown. The decision to make the letter legally binding was deliberate. He wanted to ensure that no matter who might try to interfere, reinterpret, or delay, the words on that page would stand. There would be no space for quiet lobbying, no prolonged negotiations behind closed doors. Once it was read, the transition would begin. Those who had hoped for influence or a slower, more malleable process would find none. His final act as monarch would be to ensure that his departure was his own. In the palace, the few who had seen or heard whispers of the letter's contents understood the storm it would unleash. Not because the letter was chaotic, but because it was too clear to be contested. Those who held positions of influence knew their place in the new order would change. Those who had imagined their roles growing larger would find them reduced. And yet, in its clarity, the letter also provided something rare: stability. By removing ambiguity, it left no room for drawn-out struggles. His decision to call for reconciliation within the family was perhaps the most personal element of all. It was not a command. It was a plea. He had lived long enough to see how private fractures could cast long public shadows. He wanted to close that chapter, to give his family the chance to stand together in a way they had not in years. He hoped that by stepping aside with grace, He might give them the space to rebuild what the crown had sometimes fractured. When he finally sealed the envelope, pressing his signet into the warm wax, there was a quiet finality to the moment. The decision was no longer just a thought. It was written, sealed, and ready to change everything. As he held the letter in his hands, he felt the weight of it, not just as paper, but as the embodiment of decades of duty and a single night of courage. This was a letter that would be remembered for generations, not for its flourish, but for its strength in simplicity. It was, in every way, the end of one story and the beginning of another. When the letter finally reached Camilla, the world she knew shifted beneath her feet. She had been kept at the margins of the decision, not out of cruelty but because the choice was his alone to make. Yet the contents of that letter carried implications she could not ignore. It was written with kindness, but it was also unmistakably firm. In those pages, entire ceremonial responsibilities that she had come to embody would now fade into the background. Roles she once held would be quietly reassigned, and the influence she had built over years would narrow overnight. It was not a betrayal, but it was a sharp turning point. For someone who had stood beside him through years of public appearances, this moment arrived like a silent tidal wave. She read the words slowly, over and over, trying to absorb their meaning. Each sentence carried layers of personal sentiment, constitutional clarity, and a future already decided. He had expressed gratitude for her support, acknowledged the years they had walked this public path together, and yet, he had also drawn clear lines about what the next era would look like. The letter left little room for interpretation. His successor would take the throne without divided ceremonial authority. Her own place would become smaller, more symbolic, carefully framed within the future leadership. The message was not meant to hurt, but it left no doubt. Her chapter at the center of the institution was ending. Behind closed doors, she sat in silence for a long time. She had always understood that the institution was larger than any one person. She had lived long enough to know that the crown had its own gravity, its own way of deciding who remained in the spotlight and who quietly stepped aside. But she had not expected this moment to arrive so suddenly. She had imagined a gradual shift, not a single letter that would alter everything overnight. What unsettled her was not just the decision itself, but the sheer finality of it. This was not an announcement she could reshape or slow down. It was already in motion. The palace had long been a place of invisible currents, where influence often moved quietly rather than through direct confrontation. In the hours after the letter began to circulate through the most trusted inner circles, those currents intensified. Some of her closest supporters were already whispering, asking what this would mean for their roles. Others sought reassurance, though she could offer little. The words in the letter were too clear, too definitive. This was a power shift that no amount of quiet maneuvering could undo. She understood better than most how quickly the atmosphere of the palace could change. In one day, familiar halls could take on a new weight. Conversations that once flowed freely became cautious. Eyes that once sought her approval now looked elsewhere, sensing the change in the air. The subtle hierarchy that defined everything was already beginning to realign. This was not a palace in disarray. It was a palace adjusting to a new gravitational center, one that no longer revolved around her position. For years, she had walked through those halls with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her place in the structure. She had built a network of trusted figures, navigated the delicate web of family and institution, and carved out a role that was both public and personal. She had been at the heart of countless ceremonies, official visits, and carefully crafted appearances. That role had grown to feel permanent, as though it would simply continue to evolve alongside his reign. But now, as she traced the shape of the wax seal that had sealed her fate, she realized permanence was an illusion. The reaction within the palace was immediate but layered in silence. Those loyal to her understood that the letter meant the influence they had enjoyed was also ending. Those aligned with the future leadership quietly positioned themselves for the coming shift. There were no public confrontations, no loud arguments in gilded halls. The palace did not work that way. Power here moved in whispers, subtle gestures, and invisible recalibrations. And in that quiet movement, she could feel the walls closing in. She was not unprepared for this possibility. She had always known that one day, the center of gravity would shift. But she had imagined it happening after a long, visible decline in his public role, a slow transition that would allow her to ease into a quieter life without the sting of sudden change. Instead, the letter had pulled that future forward. In a single decision, she had gone from a figure at the heart of public ceremony to someone stepping back into the shadows. It was not cruel. It was inevitable. Those who have lived close to the crown understand that influence is not guaranteed. It must constantly be negotiated in quiet rooms, maintained through appearances, and balanced against the expectations of the public. But when the monarch themselves redraws the map, everything changes. Her position was not being erased, but it was being reduced to a ceremonial outline. She would remain a figure in history, but no longer a force shaping the future. In the privacy of her rooms, away from the watchful eyes of staff, she let the reality sink in. There was no storming out, no confrontation. She had too much poise for that. But there was a quiet ache, the kind that comes from realizing that the story she had lived was coming to an end not on her timeline, but his. She respected his choice. She even understood it. But that understanding did not soften the sharpness of the moment. The letter had not only changed her personal role, it had also set off a chain reaction throughout the palace. Those who had built their positions around her found themselves uncertain. Longtime allies were already reconsidering their loyalties. The hierarchy that had taken years to build was dissolving in a matter of hours. The power she once held was now a memory, fading even as she held the letter that had defined it. The world outside would not see this part of the story. They would see official announcements, polished statements, carefully staged appearances. They would see a seamless transition, as if everything had been planned months in advance. But behind those appearances, this moment would remain sharp and unforgettable. It was the night she felt the palace shift beneath her, the night she understood that history had already moved on. She straightened the letter one last time, smoothing the creases with her hands. There was no changing it now. The decision had been made, the future had been set in motion, and her role in the center of it had come to a quiet close. She would walk out into the next day with dignity, as she always had. But she would do so knowing that a single letter had redrawn the lines of power, and she was no longer at the center of them. It was a change that would echo through every corner of the palace, a power shift that no one could ignore. The moment word of the letter leaked beyond the palace walls, the atmosphere changed completely. What had begun as a private act of quiet resolve now became a storm of whispers, hurried phone calls, and hushed strategy sessions. Inside Buckingham Palace, loyalties that had remained steady for years began to shift like sand beneath the rising tide. Those who had once operated comfortably within well-defined roles suddenly found themselves uncertain of where they stood. Some were already aligning with the new leadership, while others clung to the old structure, hoping against hope that something could be preserved. It was no longer just a letter. It was a line in the sand. In the early hours, when only a handful of trusted individuals knew the details, the palace corridors were alive with quiet tension. Some saw the abdication as a necessary and stabilizing act, a way to avoid chaos down the line. Others viewed it as an unsettling disruption, a shock to an institution that had always prided itself on continuity. Though no one said it outright, the unspoken truth lingered in the air. A change of this magnitude would not come without a struggle. The factions were forming quickly, some out of loyalty, others out of self-preservation. On one side were those who believed the king's wishes must be followed to the letter. They argued that the strength of the institution depended on respecting his decision without hesitation. Many within this group trusted the leadership of his chosen successor, believing that clarity and decisiveness would prevent drawn-out infighting. They rallied around the vision laid out in the letter, repeating the phrases he had written as if they were already law. For them, the abdication was not a crisis but a carefully crafted solution. They were determined to see it through exactly as he had intended. On the other side were those who had benefited from the current power structure. For years, their roles had been tied to the existing balance within the palace, a balance that the letter would append. They did not openly challenge the decision, but their resistance revealed itself in subtler ways. Meetings were delayed. Questions were raised. Small doubts were whispered in quiet corners. These were not loud rebels. They were careful, strategic, and deeply aware that their influence was at risk of disappearing if the transition unfolded exactly as written. The palace has always been as much about soft power as public ceremony, and these quiet currents of resistance were a reminder of just how intricate that power can be. As the hours passed, the whispers grew louder. The news of the letter's existence spread beyond the palace to trusted allies, confidants, and those who had long watched every subtle movement of the royal household. By morning, while the public still remained unaware, a full internal struggle was underway. It was not chaos in the traditional sense. There were no open confrontations in grand rooms. Instead, the palace's most powerful figures moved like chess pieces, calculating every step with precision. Every nod, every delayed signature, every sudden meeting behind closed doors carried meaning. One of the most striking things about this moment was the speed with which the landscape changed. Those who had spent years sitting on the margins of influence suddenly found themselves with new opportunities. Those who had once held unquestioned authority felt it slipping through their fingers. The balance of power was no longer fixed. It was fluid, reshaping itself around the king's final wishes. His letter had not only declared a new future but forced everyone inside the palace to choose which side of that future they would stand on. For his sister, this was the moment she had prepared for. Her role was no longer symbolic. It was central. The king had trusted her to steady the transition, and she did so with quiet precision. She did not involve herself in whispered arguments or desperate positioning. She moved calmly, her presence itself acting as a signal of where the true authority now rested. Those who had doubted the seriousness of the letter began to realize that it was not a draft. It was an instruction. The king had chosen his successor. He had mapped the transition. All that remained was to follow it. In contrast, the quiet resistance aligned around Camilla struggled to maintain footing. The letter had left little space for negotiation, and the new leadership had the clear advantage of certainty. Even those who had once leaned toward her side began to see where the winds were blowing. A new center of gravity was forming. One by one, allegiances shifted. What had been a palace defined by competing influences was beginning to coalesce around a single vision. It did not happen with declarations or dramatic confrontations. It happened through silence, through the subtle but unmistakable way power moves when it is no longer contested. Outside the palace, senior staff began to prepare for the public unveiling. Protocol dictated that the letter would be read aloud in a formal announcement. The words would not be changed. Every line would be presented exactly as he had written them. Even those who might have preferred to delay the moment knew there was no realistic way to alter the course now. The abdication was set in motion. It was not a matter of if, but when. In these tense hours, the palace revealed its true nature. It was not just a building of ceremony. It was a machine of influence, finely tuned and capable of moving with speed when forced to. For decades, it had relied on continuity to keep itself stable. Now, it was learning to shift quickly under pressure. What could have been a prolonged power struggle was becoming something else entirely. Those who recognized the inevitability of the change adapted fast. Those who resisted found themselves standing on thinning ice. The king's decision had not only defined the next chapter but also stripped away illusions about where power truly resided. For years, influence had seemed diffuse, spread across different figures and factions. But in the end, it was always his decision that mattered. And now, with his letter sealed and soon to be made public, everyone understood what that meant. The palace was no longer debating whether change would come. It was preparing for its arrival. It is in these moments that history is not only made but felt. The shift was not loud. It was quiet, efficient, and deeply personal. It moved through whispered hallways, through the minds of people who understood that they were standing at the edge of a turning point. And as the clock ticked toward the public reading, the palace settled into a strange stillness, the kind that comes right before everything changes. The image of a long and unbroken royal lineage has always carried with it a sense of inevitability. Yet here, in this singular moment, that image has been reshaped. As the former king stepped into a quieter existence away from the relentless rhythm of ceremonial life, the balance within the royal family shifted in a way no one could ignore. Those closest to him found themselves confronting a new dynamic, one that required clarity, humility, and a shared understanding of what the institution could and should become. William stepped forward, not as a mere successor, but as a figure now carrying the immense weight of history, expectation, and the delicate hope of the people who had watched this chapter unfold. For William, the transition into leadership was never meant to be an explosion of spectacle, but rather a quiet and steady acceptance of duty. In the first weeks that followed, his approach to leadership reflected a clear desire to create stability before making change. Advisors observed how his language shifted from ceremonial to direct, from performative to practical. It was not the grandeur of the moment that defined him, but the quiet conviction behind each decision. The palace became less about tradition alone and more about clarity, trust, and consistent messaging to the public. It was this steadiness, not loud declarations, that began to redefine the atmosphere around the monarchy itself, and emerged as the anchor that held the early stages of this new era together. Her position, strengthened through Charles's final letter, gave her a defined and respected role. Unlike a figure seeking attention, she operated quietly, offering counsel, stability, and the reassurance of familiarity. For many within the family and those working behind the scenes, an steady hand became a comforting constant. She bridged the old and the new, reminding everyone of the lineage they came from while giving space for William to shape his own path. Her presence was not ceremonial but foundational, making her a central force in ensuring that the transition remained calm, disciplined, and orderly. The former queen, once a visible presence at major engagements, began stepping back from the forefront of public life. What was once a shared stage now belonged primarily to William and Anne. Her role, while still recognized, was no longer central to the unfolding story of the crown. Over time, the shift was subtle yet unmistakable. Public appearances became fewer, and the focus of official narratives began moving away from her entirely. The palace, ever aware of public perception, quietly adjusted the narrative to reflect a future built on the image of unity between the new king and his steadfast sister. In the months that followed, the abdication letter continued to shape the internal structure of the monarchy. Legal scholars, historians, and commentators examined its language with great attention, noting how carefully it was crafted to leave little room for manipulation or reinterpretation. The decision to step down had not been impulsive but methodical, layered with personal emotion and structural intent. Its influence was not just symbolic but practical. It forced those within the institution to adapt swiftly, aligning with the former king's final wishes. Those who resisted found themselves without leverage, while those who embraced the new order found renewed purpose in their roles. Public sentiment evolved alongside these internal changes. The shock of the abdication gave way to cautious acceptance, and eventually to a sense of curiosity about what the future might hold. Crowds gathered outside royal residences not with outrage but with quiet reflection. The idea of a king choosing to step aside willingly carried a strange sense of dignity, and for many, it symbolized a shift from rigidity to a more human understanding of leadership. People did not see a broken institution but one capable of transformation. The tone of discussions changed, and with it, the relationship between the monarchy and the people it represented began to subtly recalibrate. Behind the scenes, William made deliberate moves to modernize the operational structure of the institution itself. This did not mean abandoning tradition entirely, but rather streamlining outdated practices that no longer served the family or its public image. Ceremonies were refined, communication became more direct, and the focus shifted toward tangible actions rather than purely symbolic gestures. It was a careful balancing act, maintaining the dignity of history while acknowledging the expectations of a changing world. The deliberate nature of each adjustment reflected the thoughtful groundwork laid long before his formal rise. Charles's retreat from public life was characterized by deliberate quiet rather than exile. Those close to him described a man who found peace in stepping away from the center of public attention. His appearances were rare and modest, creating a clear and respectful boundary between the past and the present. This distance allowed William the full space to lead without overshadowing or interference, something that not every leader has the benefit of. In his absence, his legacy was defined less by the noise of public commentary and more by the clarity of the letter he left behind. That single act became both a curtain close and an opening chapter. In the years that followed, the monarchy began to be perceived not as an immovable monument but as a living structure capable of recalibration. The former king's decision to step aside willingly set a precedent that would echo far beyond his lifetime. Historians noted it as a defining moment, not for scandal or fracture, but for deliberate and thoughtful change from within. It was not the roar of an ending, but the steady breath of a beginning. The institution did not crumble. Instead, it shifted its weight, adjusted its stance, and kept moving forward. The story of this turning point would come to be remembered not just as a moment of personal choice, but as a symbol of something larger. It reflected the fragility of power, the endurance of duty, and the possibility of transition without chaos. In the end, it was a quiet letter written by a weary hand that changed everything. A private midnight conversation. A carefully chosen successor. A sister's unwavering presence. A public that learned to see change not as an ending but as a reimagining of what has always been. This was not simply the end of one reign. It was the redefinition of what it means to hold the weight of a crown.